There is a castle in northern Slovakia that rises from a vertical cliff above a river, and in the summer of 1921, a German film crew arrived with a single camera, a tight budget, and a director looking for something that felt genuinely inhuman. F.W. Murnau found it at Orava. The castle that became Count Orlok's lair in Nosferatu had been climbing its limestone spur for nearly 7 centuries before the film crew arrived. It had watched Mongol invasions, a trade route to Poland, 7 dynasties of owners, the Reformation, a friendship between the most powerful man in Hungary and the most notorious woman in European history, and a fire that burned for 2 weeks and left it a ruin. All of that happened before it became famous as a vampire's home. The real story is stranger than the legend. Chapter 1. The Rock, the River, and the People Before the Castle. Prehistory to 1241. The limestone spur above the Orava River was never empty. The geological formation that would become the foundation of one of Central Europe's most dramatically positioned castles is a natural phenomenon of the Western Carpathians, a narrow ridge of hard limestone pushed upward by the same tectonic forces that built the mountain ranges surrounding it, carved by the Orava River and its tributary, the Rachava, into a near-vertical prominence that rises 112 meters above the valley floor. 3 sides of the spur are essentially unclimbable, sheer rock faces above fast-moving water that make any assault from those directions a practical impossibility. The 4th side, where the ridge connects to the surrounding plateau, is steep enough that a defender with simple barriers could hold it against a much larger force. The site is, by any standard of defensive assessment, close to ideal. The people who first recognized this quality were not medieval castle builders. Archaeological excavations in the upper portions of the castle site have recovered evidence of human occupation extending through multiple prehistoric periods. Hallstatt culture material, artifacts associated with the early Iron Age communities that occupied Central European highland sites from roughly 800 to 450 BCE, appears in the excavated layers alongside evidence of earlier Bronze Age activity. The spur was being used as a defended elevated settlement long before any concept of castle architecture existed in the region. The strategic logic was identical: an elevated position above a river crossing, defensible on most sides by natural features, commanding the approaches through the valley below. The valley below was an important one. The Orava River Valley, running northward from the interior of what is now Slovakia toward the Carpathian passes, formed a segment of one of medieval Central Europe's most significant trade routes, the Via Magna, the great road connecting the Kingdom of Hungary to Poland. Amber from the Baltic coast moved southward along this route, making the Orava Valley part of what merchants and geographers of the classical and early medieval periods called the Amber Road, the ancient commercial corridor along which the fossilized resin that the ancient world valued as a luxury commodity traveled from its collection points on the Baltic shore to the Mediterranean markets that consumed it. Salt, metals, textiles, and the full range of goods that pre-modern economies required to function moved through this valley in both directions. Whoever controlled the valley floor controlled a slice of the commercial life of a continent. The Slavic peoples who inhabited the Orava Valley in the centuries before the establishment of the Kingdom of Hungary maintained their own fortified sites on the spur, evidence of which appears in the archaeological record beneath the medieval masonry. The Great Moravian State, the political entity that dominated the central Danubian region in the 9th century, whose cultural and ecclesiastical legacy shaped the subsequent Christian civilization of the entire region, extended its administrative presence through the valleys of what is now Slovakia. The missionaries sent by Cyril and Methodius from Constantinople in 863, whose work in establishing the Slavonic liturgy and the Glagolitic alphabet represents one of the founding cultural acts of Eastern European civilization, operated within the territory that the Orava Spur overlooked. The valley had been civilized for a very long time before the first document mentioned anything like a castle there. The Arpad dynasty's establishment of the Kingdom of Hungary in the late 9th and 10th centuries brought the Orava Valley into a new political order. The Magyar tribes who crossed the Carpathians and established themselves in the Pannonian Basin incorporated the highland regions of what is now Slovakia into their expanding kingdom through a combination of military pressure and the administrative integration that followed military success. The Slavic populations of the Orava Valley became subjects of the Hungarian crown, not displaced or destroyed, as the folklore of later centuries sometimes suggested, but absorbed into a political system that their descendants would inhabit for the next 1,000 years. The trade routes they had used remained in use. The defensive sites they had occupied remained occupied. The language and culture of the Orava people maintained its Slavic character through centuries of Hungarian political rule. The Balassa family, a Hungarian noble lineage whose name appears in the earliest documentary evidence connected to the Orava site, held the spur and whatever fortification existed upon it in the period leading up to 1267. Whether the Balassas had built the first stone structure on the site, or inherited an earlier fortification from the Slavic period, or simply claimed administrative control of a site that predated their involvement, is not established by the surviving documents. They are the first named owners, which means they are the first link in a chain of ownership that leads through 7.5 centuries of Hungarian, Slovak, Austrian, Czechoslovak, and Slovak history to the present. The event that ended the Balassa period and initiated the documented history of the castle was not a battle or a purchase or a dynastic extinction. It was a catastrophe of such scale that it transformed the political and military architecture of an entire kingdom. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241. The army that descended on the Kingdom of Hungary in the spring of 1241 was among the most formidable military forces the medieval world had produced. Under the command of Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and his brilliant general Subutai, who had spent years preparing the invasion with intelligence-gathering operations of remarkable thoroughness, 5 separate Mongol armies invaded Hungary through different Carpathian passes simultaneously, coordinating their movements across hundreds of kilometers with a precision that the Hungarian defenders could not match. At the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, the Hungarian army was annihilated. King Bela IV barely escaped with his life, eventually finding refuge in Dalmatia, while his kingdom was ravaged behind him. Contemporary accounts describe the devastation as almost beyond expression. The monk Rogerius of Apulia, who survived the invasion in captivity, wrote that when the Mongols finally withdrew, the surviving population emerged from forests and swamps to find a landscape unrecognizable in its destruction. Estimates of Hungarian population loss during the year of Mongol occupation range widely, but figures of 25 to 50% appear in modern scholarship. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, enslaved, or dead from famine and disease in the wake of the armies. The northwestern regions of the kingdom, including the Orava Valley, suffered somewhat less than the lowland areas that bore the brunt of the campaign, but no part of Hungary was unaffected. The Mongols withdrew in 1242 when the death of the great Khan Ogadei created a succession crisis that required the princes of blood to return to Mongolia. Their withdrawal was not a defeat. They left when they chose to, but it was permanent. Bela IV returned to find a kingdom that needed to be rebuilt from near ruin, and a military system that the catastrophe had demonstrated was completely inadequate. The Hungarian royal army, composed primarily of light cavalry in the Magyar tradition, had been destroyed by Mongol tactics that exploited its weaknesses systematically. Whatever replaced it had to be different. Bela IV spent the rest of his reign constructing what historians have called the second foundation of Hungary. He rebuilt the population through large-scale immigration programs. He reorganized the army, and he built castles, stone castles, on commanding sites throughout the kingdom, creating a defensive network that would stop any future Mongol or other invasion at fortified strongpoints, rather than relying on open-field armies that the Mongols had shown they could destroy. By the end of his reign, the kingdom that had possessed perhaps 10 stone castles in 1241 possessed something approaching 150. Orava was among them. The legends generated by the Mongol catastrophe in the Orava Valley are among the oldest that attach to the site, and they show the characteristic pattern by which communities process overwhelming historical violence through supernatural narrative. According to stories collected from the Orava region in the 19th century, the spur above the river was occupied during the Mongol invasion not by a Hungarian garrison, but by the spirits of the valley's ancient dead. Presences who had inhabited the rock since the earliest human occupation and who manifested during the invasion to protect the people who took refuge in the caves and fissures of the cliff face. These spirits, the stories held, were neither Christian nor pagan in any clearly defined sense. They were older than either, bound to the limestone and the river, concerned with the specific human community of the Orava Valley rather than with any theological framework. The Mongols, in these accounts, approached the cliff and felt the presence of something that could not be explained by the categories available to steppe warriors, and they turned aside. The historical reality that the northwestern highlands of Hungary were less thoroughly devastated than the lowlands, partly because the terrain made rapid cavalry movement more difficult, and partly because the Mongol strategy focused on the densely populated plains, is not incompatible with the legend. Communities that survived while neighboring communities perished naturally developed narratives explaining their survival. The cliff and the river really did provide protection. That the protection was supernatural rather than geological is a distinction that may have seemed academic to people who looked up at the spur and knew it had sheltered their grandparents. Chapter 2. Bela's Stone Castle and the Royal Borderland, 1241 to 1370. The first documented stone castle at Orava was built in the years immediately following the Mongol withdrawal. Bela IV's systematic castle-building program across Hungary was one of the most concentrated periods of military construction in medieval European history, and it was driven by a specific strategic assessment. The wooden earthwork fortifications that had characterized Hungarian defensive architecture before 1241 had proven useless against Mongol siege techniques, while the handful of stone castles on commanding sites had held. The conclusion was obvious. Every vulnerable border approach needed a stone fortress on the most defensible available site. The Orava Valley approach through the Carpathians to Poland needed exactly such a fortification, and the limestone spur above the river bend was the best available site. The first written record dates to 1267, when a royal document describes Bela IV receiving the castle from Mika of the Balassa family in exchange for other lands. The document's language reveals that the castle was already an established entity at that moment. The transaction is an exchange of existing properties, not the grant of newly constructed ones. The construction itself therefore predates the document, probably by 1 to 2 decades. The masonry work that created the first stone castle at Orava was almost certainly underway in the late 1240s or early 1250s, the period when Bela's construction program was at its most intensive across the kingdom. The form of the first stone castle was shaped by the spur's geology with an intimacy that makes the two almost inseparable. The limestone ridge runs roughly east-west across a length of approximately 520 meters, narrowing significantly toward its eastern end, where it terminates in a near-vertical drop to the river below. The builders placed the most defensible elements, the keep, the primary tower, at this easternmost point, where the natural defenses were strongest. The keep that rose from this work was a tetrahedral multi-story tower of substantial dimensions. Walls of considerable thickness, narrow openings that provided minimal surface for attackers while allowing defenders inside to direct fire outward, the characteristic profile of a structure designed first and entirely for the function of holding ground under assault. It is the oldest surviving element of the Orava complex, and in its lower courses, it represents some of the earliest castle architecture in present-day Slovakia. The structure as built was a hybrid of stone and timber in the manner characteristic of the first generation of post-Mongol Hungarian fortifications. The ground floor and the primary structural elements were stone, providing the permanence and fire resistance that the Mongol catastrophe had demonstrated was necessary, while the upper floors and secondary structures were timber, providing construction speed and economy. This was not primitive improvisation, but a deliberate engineering strategy. The stone provided the permanent defensive core that no wooden structure could match, while the timber allowed the garrison space it needed at lower cost and in shorter time than all stone construction would have required. The strategic function was precisely what Bela had intended. Orava controlled the Via Magna trade route through the valley. Anyone moving between Hungary and Poland through this corridor passed within sight and potential range of the castle. The garrison that Bela appointed, a castellan, a royal official representing the crown's authority, with a small military force sufficient to monitor the road and collect the tolls that the crown levied on commercial traffic, could not stop a serious military force, but it could observe one, report northward and southward along the route, and hold against small raiding parties long enough for relief to arrive. This was the function of the first Orava Castle, not to be an impregnable fortress, but to be a reliable watchpost on an important corridor. The Balassa family's previous ownership suggests that before Bela's systematic castle program, a family of local Hungarian nobility had been managing whatever precursor fortification the spur supported. The Balassas were not a major dynasty. Their appearance in this document as landowners exchanging a castle for other properties places them in the middle rank of Hungarian nobility, substantial enough to hold administrative responsibilities, but not powerful enough to resist royal appropriation when the crown needed their assets for strategic purposes. The transaction of 1267 was probably less voluntary than the documentary form suggests. Bela was assembling his defensive network, and the Balassas provided what he needed when he asked, receiving compensation that was presumably adequate, if not generous. The castle's function as a royal watching post in the decades following 1267 generated the administrative machinery that would persist through most of its subsequent history. A royal castellan appointed by the crown, responsible for maintaining the garrison, collecting tolls, administering justice in the surrounding territory, and representing the crown's authority to the population of the Orava Valley. This administrative function, the castle as the physical expression of royal governance in a remote mountain region, proved more durable than any of the castle's military functions. Wars came and went, trade routes shifted, military technology changed. The administrative role, the castle as the seat of the county that developed around it, persisted for centuries. The first generation of folklore attached specifically to the stone castle rather than to the pre-castle site developed during this early royal period. The most persistent concerns the well. Water supply was the existential problem of any castle on an elevated site. The spur at Orava was 112 meters above the river, and any garrison sustaining a siege needed water that did not require descending through enemy forces to reach it. The solution was to cut a well directly into the limestone, an achievement of remarkable difficulty given the hardness of the rock and the tools available in the 13th century. The well that was eventually dug through the castle cliff reached the water table after considerable labor, and the story that attached to it reflected both the difficulty of the achievement and the medieval tendency to attribute remarkable engineering feats to supernatural agency. According to the legend, the well was not dug by human labor at all, but was the work of a condemned man, a prisoner held in the castle who was offered his freedom if he could reach water by digging. The prisoner dug for years, sustained by the hope of release and by the castle's meager provisions, going deeper and deeper through the rock with nothing but hand tools and determination. When he finally struck water, the Castellan— the story varies on whether this was from cruelty or simple pragmatic reasoning— decided that a man who knew the location of the castle's water supply and the way through the cliff to reach it was too valuable a secret to release. The prisoner was executed. The well remained, and on certain nights, particularly in winter when the cold drove sounds deeper into the stone, workers in the lower passages of the castle reported hearing the sound of a man digging somewhere below them, always deeper, never reaching the surface. The story is structurally familiar from the folklore traditions of castle wells across Central and Eastern Europe. Almost every medieval castle with a difficult water supply has a similar tale about the labor required to achieve it. What is particular to Orava is the specific detail of betrayal, the promise of freedom given and rescinded, the skill that condemned rather than liberated the man who had it. This dark irony runs through much of Orava's folklore, an undercurrent of authority that uses and discards people with the same indifference that a fortress wall uses and discards the stone placed in it. By 1307, Orava Castle had fallen into the hands of one of the most powerful regional magnates of the early 14th century, Matusz Czak of Trenčín, known to history as the Lord of the Va and the Tatras. Czak was the most successful of several Hungarian magnates who took advantage of the dynastic struggles following the extinction of the Arpad dynasty in 1301 to establish effectively independent territorial power across the kingdom's northern regions. He controlled a network of castles across what is now western Slovakia, ruling his territory with a degree of autonomy that the new Angevin dynasty of Charles Robert of Hungary, who became king in 1308, was determined to dismantle. Orava was one of the castles through which Czak projected his power northward through the Carpathian passes. Czak's power was extraordinary, but not permanent. He died in 1321 without heirs, and the magnate principality he had constructed dissolved. Charles Robert of Hungary systematically recovered the castles that Czak had controlled, and Orava returned to royal administration under the crown of the Angevin dynasty that would rule Hungary until the mid-14th century. The castle was incorporated into the administrative machinery of the expanding Hungarian state. Its function as a trade route guardian and regional administrative center confirmed rather than changed by the transition from independent magnate control to royal administration. Under Charles Robert and his successor Louis I, called Louis the Great, who ruled Hungary from 1342 to 1382 and at his peak also controlled Poland, the castle underwent the first of its major expansions. In 1370, Orava became formally the administrative center of Arva County, one of the basic administrative units of the Hungarian kingdom's organization. The castle's role as county seat elevated its importance from a watching post on a trade route to the physical center of a governmental unit, requiring spaces for judicial proceedings, record storage, official accommodation, and the ceremonial functions that county administration demanded. New construction followed this administrative elevation. A tetrahedral multi-story tower built in the 14th century on older foundations served as the donjon, the ultimate defensive refuge and the symbol of authority, while the main palace was developed to provide the residential and ceremonial spaces that a county seat required. Chapter 3. Corvinus, the Renaissance Palace, and the Amber Route at its height, 1370 to 1556. The decades between the castle's establishment as a county seat and its acquisition by the Thurzo family were defined by two forces: the changing ambitions of successive owners who saw Orava as an opportunity for self-advancement rather than a responsibility to the crown, and the military innovations of the late medieval period that rendered the castle's original defensive architecture progressively less adequate. The Hussite Wars, the religious and military upheaval that erupted in Bohemia following the execution of Jan Hus in 1415 and convulsed Central Europe through the following decades, reached the Orava region with their characteristic mixture of ideological conviction and military destruction. Hussite forces conducted raids into the northern regions of the Hungarian kingdom, and the castle's position on the trade route that connected Bohemia's neighbors to Poland made it both strategically relevant and a target. The reinforcement of the castle's defenses during this period, additional walls, strengthened gate arrangements, the attention to the architectural weaknesses that siege experience revealed, was part of the broader process by which the entire Hungarian defensive network adapted to the new military reality of 15th century warfare. The castle also suffered an early Hussite incident characteristic of the era. In 1434, during a period when the castle's nominal owners were absent, a Hussite unit under a commander identified in the documents as Blay occupied the castle. Whether by assault, treachery, or the simple opportunism that undefended strategic sites always attracted is not clear from the surviving record. The occupation was temporary. The castle was recovered. But the episode demonstrated the vulnerability created by absentee ownership and inadequate garrison, a lesson that subsequent owners would apply with varying degrees of thoroughness. The castle's most consequential pre-Thurzo owner arrived through the particular mechanism of personal loyalty to a powerful king. Stibor of Stiborich, a Moravian knight who rose to extraordinary prominence in the Hungarian court of Sigismund of Luxembourg, received Orava as part of the extensive reward that Sigismund distributed to the Slavic nobles, who provided the administrative backbone of his complex multinational empire. Stibor managed the Orava estate during the early 15th century with the efficiency of a man who had earned his position through competence rather than birth, investing in the castle's maintenance and the administration of the surrounding territory with pragmatic thoroughness. His tenure represents a phase in the castle's history when it was genuinely managed rather than merely exploited, when the revenues from the trade route were reinvested in the infrastructure that protected them. The arrival of Matthias Corvinus on the Hungarian throne in 1458 initiated a period of transformation across the Hungarian kingdom that touched Orava as it touched every significant royal property. Matthias was the most remarkable ruler Hungary produced in the medieval period, a man whose military achievements, administrative reforms, and cultural patronage made his court one of the most sophisticated in contemporary Europe. He brought Italian Renaissance ideas northward with the enthusiasm of a genuine humanist, sponsoring architecture, scholarship, and the arts with a largesse that reflected both his cultural interests and his political understanding that magnificence was a form of power. After 1474, Matthias gave orders to build a square tower and a new residence wing in the middle castle at Orava. The palace that emerged from this commission, known as the Corvinus Palace after its royal patron, reflected the Renaissance aesthetic that Italian craftsmen were bringing to Central European courts in the second half of the 15th century. The palace had two short wings, a basement, and chambers with vaulted ceilings. The first floor featured a wooden porch connecting it to the rebuilt four-sided tower, creating an architectural ensemble that combined defense and residence in the proportions that Renaissance thinking about noble life encouraged. The exterior had the representation quality, the deliberate announcement of taste and cultivation, that distinguished Renaissance building from medieval utility. Matthias also expanded the lower ward and constructed the southern horseshoe tower, called the Archive Tower, which flanked the entrance gate and served both defensive and administrative purposes, the archive function reflecting the growing importance of written documentation in Hungarian administration. A ditch cut directly into the rock in front of the entrance gate provided an additional defensive barrier that required potential attackers to cross before reaching the gate itself. The castle that emerged from Matthias's investment was larger, more defensible, more comfortable, and more beautiful than anything that had existed on the spur before. The trade route that the castle monitored was at or near its historical peak in the late 15th century. The Amber Road had expanded far beyond its original commodity. It was now a general commercial corridor carrying a remarkable range of goods between the markets of Poland, Silesia, Hungary, and ultimately the broader European commercial network that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Merchants traveling through the Orava Valley paid tolls at the castle's gate. Their inventories and the tax records generated by their passage provide some of the best evidence available for the commercial life of the region. Cloth from Silesian workshops, metal goods from Hungarian craftsmen, wine moving northward, grain moving southward. The castle stood above a road that generated substantial revenue, and the castellan responsible for collecting that revenue was one of the most financially consequential administrators in northern Hungary. The succession crisis following Matthias Corvinus's death in 1490 destabilized the castle's ownership through a period of competing claims and volatile political alignments. His illegitimate son, John Corvinus, who inherited Orava, did not inherit his father's abilities. John leased, pledged, and ultimately lost control of Orava through a series of transactions that reflected his broader inability to manage the inheritance his father had assembled. The castle passed through the hands of the Zápolya family, a powerful Hungarian magnate lineage that would eventually produce a rival claimant to the Hungarian throne. Before the dynastic catastrophe that ended independent Hungarian history created the conditions under which the Thurzo family would eventually acquire it. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where the Ottoman army of Suleiman the Magnificent destroyed the Hungarian army and killed the Hungarian king Louis II, created a vacuum of authority across the kingdom that the competing claims of the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand and the Hungarian nobleman John Zápolya filled with nearly a generation of civil war. In this context, loyalty to one side or the other became the primary currency through which ambitious nobles could advance their positions. Archduke Ferdinand, seeking to build a reliable support base in the Hungarian nobility, distributed castles and titles to those who proved their loyalty. In 1526, as reward for the copper magnate Alexius Thurzo's support, Ferdinand donated the Orava Castle to the Thurzo family. The dynasty that would define the castle's character for the next century had arrived. The folklore of the late Corvinus and early Jagiellonian period at Orava concerns the castle's apparent supernatural accessibility to people whose access should have been impossible. The most developed of these stories involves a messenger, sometimes identified as a Dominican friar, sometimes as a royal courier, who claimed to have entered the castle at night when it was locked and the gates barred, passing through the walls without any physical means of entry. The messenger's purpose varies in different versions, delivering a warning of imminent attack, bringing news of a royal death, carrying a letter whose content the legitimate castellan refused to transmit. Whatever the specific cargo, the story is consistent in its central claim. The walls of Orava were not, for certain categories of person on certain categories of mission, actually barriers. The legend connects to a real feature of the castle's architecture: the three gates linked by a tunnel that constitutes the castle's entry system. The tunnel, cut through solid rock between two of the gates, is disorienting in its course. It does not proceed in a straight line, but turns and angles in ways that confuse spatial orientation. Anyone who knows the tunnel well can navigate it rapidly. Anyone unfamiliar with it can become genuinely lost in it. The stories of mysterious entry may reflect the experience of people who navigated this tunnel by routes they were unwilling to explain, exploiting knowledge of the castle's geography that they had not acquired through any obvious legitimate means. Chapter 4. The Thurzo Dynasty, the richest family in Hungary, and the Blood Countess, 1526 to 1621. When the Thurzo family acquired Orava in 1526, they were already among the most powerful and wealthy families in the Kingdom of Hungary. Perhaps the most powerful family, by some measures, in the entire multi-ethnic, multi-religious kingdom that the Habsburgs were attempting to hold together against Ottoman pressure and internal rebellion. The Thurzo fortune derived from copper. The family's base was in Banska Bystrica, the mining city in central Slovakia that sat at the center of one of Europe's most productive copper-producing regions. From the 15th century, the Thurzos had been the dominant force in the copper industry of the Hungarian highlands, controlling not just the mining operations, but the smelting, processing, and export of the metal that was essential to the cannon-founding, coin-minting, and manufacturing operations of the early modern European economy. The partnership they had formed with the Fugger banking family of Augsburg, possibly the greatest financial house in early 16th century Europe, had given their operations a capitalization and a market reach that transformed regional mining enterprise into something approaching modern industrial-scale production. By 1526, the Thurzos were generating revenues that dwarfed those of most European noble families, and they spent them with the confidence of people who expected to keep earning them. The acquisition of Orava Castle was consistent with the family's general strategy of building a territorial base in the Hungarian highlands that matched their economic dominance with political and administrative power. A copper magnate who also held county-level administrative authority over a large region of northern Hungary was not merely a rich man. He was a lord, with the governance functions that distinguished genuine nobility from mere wealth. The Thurzos wanted to be lords, and the acquisition of castles with their associated county seats was how lords were made. Francis Thurzo, who took possession of Orava in 1556 after the death of the previous holder Jan of Dubovec without heirs, initiated the most ambitious construction program the castle had undergone since the Corvinus era. The challenges he faced were both structural and functional. The castle's medieval and early Renaissance fabric needed substantial repair and reinforcement in areas where age and limited maintenance had allowed deterioration, and the spaces available within the existing structures were inadequate for the residential and ceremonial requirements of a family of the Thurzos' standing. Francis approached these challenges systematically. The upper castle's rotten timber stairs, which had been deteriorating for years and presented genuine safety concerns for the garrison and residents, were replaced with stone, a more expensive but permanent solution. The problem of water supply that had troubled the castle since its foundation was finally resolved in a way that reflected both engineering sophistication and available resources. Francis had a well cut through the limestone cliff, solving the siege supply problem that the folk legend of the condemned prisoner had dramatized in darker terms. A cellar was excavated from the living rock of the castle courtyard, providing storage for the provisions and wine that a noble residence required. A new single-story residence wing was built in the lower castle near the west wall, expanding the living space available for the family and their household. The cannon bastions that Francis added to the castle's defenses represented the most significant response to the military reality of the mid-16th century. The development of artillery had been transforming European military architecture since the late 15th century, and the adaptation to artillery defense required a fundamentally different approach to fortification design than the vertical walls and towers of medieval construction. Two large round cannon bastions, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the castle's approaches, gave Orava the ability to bring artillery to bear on attacking forces at the distances that artillery warfare demanded. The defensive investment was not merely aesthetic or ceremonial. It reflected genuine assessment of the threat environment. The Ottoman advance into Hungary had reached far enough northward that the possibility of a major Ottoman force reaching the Orava Valley, while unlikely, was not inconceivable. And the anti-Habsburg rebellions that periodically erupted among the Hungarian nobility created their own threats to strategically valuable properties. George Thurzo, who inherited Orava in 1574 at the age of 8 when his father Francis died, did not take personal control of the castle's affairs until he reached maturity. In the intervening years, George Abafi administered the estate, ensuring that the ongoing construction and maintenance work continued. When George Thurzo finally assumed direct authority, he had both the resources and the vision to complete the transformation of Orava that his father had begun, and to do it in a style that announced his position as the most powerful nobleman in Habsburg Hungary. The construction George undertook between his assumption of control and the completion of the castle's present form in 1611 represents the defining phase of Orava's architectural history. He built a tunnel between both castle gates, above which a large terrace was formed that provided panoramic views of the valley and served as an outdoor space for the castle's residents. He moved the living quarters to better-positioned sections of the complex. Most significantly, he built the chapel, the religious centerpiece of a castle that had always had some provision for worship but had never possessed a proper dedicated chapel of the quality appropriate to a family of Lutheran magnates who understood that religious space was a statement of identity as well as a spiritual resource. George Thurzo was a devout Lutheran in a historical moment when religious affiliation was politically explosive. The Counter-Reformation was reshaping the religious landscape of Central Europe, and the Habsburgs, who were the dynastic suzerains of the Hungarian kingdom and committed Catholics, were applying increasing pressure on Protestant nobles to conform or face consequences. George navigated this pressure with considerable skill. He remained loyal to the Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II, even when anti-Habsburg rebellions erupted among other Hungarian noblemen, earning in 1606 the formal grant of Orava Castle and its county as his permanent estate, a reward for loyalty that transformed his family's administrative role into outright ownership. In 1609, that loyalty received its ultimate acknowledgement. George Thurzo was appointed Palatine of Hungary, the most senior administrative position in the kingdom, equivalent to a prime minister or viceroy serving under the Habsburg king. The Palatine of Hungary was a man of extraordinary power. He stood between the king and the Hungarian nobility, mediating conflicts, administering justice, representing royal authority, while also defending noble privileges. George Thurzo brought to the office the qualities that had defined his personal career: administrative competence, Lutheran religious conviction expressed through institutional action rather than personal confrontation, and an unsentimental understanding of where political power lay and how to maintain access to it. He built Lutheran churches on his estates, established Lutheran guilds, and in 1610 issued a decree asserting the principle of cuius regio, ius religio. The ruler determines the religion of his territory, which was both a statement of religious conviction and a political claim about the extent of palatinal authority. It is in this context of peak Thurzo power that the most dramatic connection in the castle's history must be understood: the relationship between George Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, and Elizabeth Bathory, the woman known to history as the Blood Countess. The connection was direct and personal. Elizabeth Bathory was George Thurzo's cousin by marriage, close enough family that her affairs were also his family's reputation. Her late husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, had before his death in 1604 entrusted his heirs and widow specifically to George Thurzo's protection and oversight. The woman accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young women, peasant girls first, then, fatally, young women of noble birth, was in a real sense George's charge, a family responsibility that her alleged crimes transformed into a crisis of profound complexity. The accusations against Bathory had been circulating for years before Thurzo was directed to investigate them formally. Emperor Matthias II, seeking to address the complaints that had been accumulating and perhaps also interested in the financial possibilities that a conviction might open, assigned the investigation to Thurzo in 1610. The case that developed over the following year was one of the most remarkable in Central European legal history. Hundreds of witnesses were interviewed, extensive depositions were taken, and a picture of systematic cruelty was assembled that contemporary observers found credible enough to support action. Whether that picture was entirely accurate is a question historians have debated for centuries without reaching consensus. The evidence against Bathory was substantial. More than 300 witnesses testified to crimes that went far beyond the exaggerated rumors that powerful enemies sometimes manufactured. But it was also gathered through a process that George Thurzo controlled entirely, using methods including torture that contemporary law permitted but that modern evidentiary standards would exclude. Thurzo's own political and financial interests in Bathory's downfall were significant. Her estates were enormous, her political network was formidable, and her defeat would remove a potential rival and open opportunities for the redistribution of assets. The investigation may have been entirely legitimate. It may have been partly or substantially shaped by the investigators' interests. The ambiguity cannot be resolved. What is certain is that on New Year's Eve 1610, Thurzo arrived at Bathory's castle at Choctawcho and arrested her along with 4 servants. The servants were tried, and 3 were executed. Bathory herself was never brought to trial. Thurzo argued, apparently successfully, that the public disgrace of a formal trial for a woman of her lineage would damage the nobility's reputation in ways that outweighed the justice of a public execution. She was confined in her castle at Choctawcho, walled into a suite of rooms with only slots for food delivery, and left there. She died in 1614. George Thurzo's role in the Bathory affair is inseparable from his administrative authority, and his administrative authority was concentrated in Orava Castle. The depositions taken from witnesses were processed and analyzed by clerks working in the castle's administrative chambers. The correspondence between Thurzo and the emperor about how to handle Bathory passed through Orava's chancery. The decision about her fate, confinement rather than trial and execution, was made by a man who held his authority from the castle that was his administrative base. The legend that attached itself to the Bathory connection at Orava is appropriately dark and somewhat surprising in its specifics. The story that circulates locally claims that Elizabeth Bathory herself visited Orava Castle on multiple occasions during the years before her arrest, that she was a guest of the Thurzo household, present in the same halls where subsequent visitors would centuries later sit for guided tours. Whether these visits occurred is not documented in the surviving records, but given the family relationship and George's oversight role for Bathory's household after her husband's death, the premise is not implausible. The legend goes further, that strange sounds were heard in the castle after Bathory's imprisonment, sounds that the household staff attributed to her presence even at this distance, that her cruelty had somehow infected the castle she had visited, leaving a resonance that the building retained long after she was gone. George Thurzo died in 1616. He had achieved the highest position available to a Hungarian noble, transformed Orava Castle into a residence of genuine magnificence, navigated the religious and political crises of his era with remarkable skill, and left behind the Renaissance chapel with its elaborate altar and furnishings that visitors admire today. His tomb is within that chapel, a Renaissance grave monument that is among the finest in Slovakia, a physical embodiment of the man's conviction that art and faith and power were inseparable, and that all 3 should be expressed in stone. Chapter 5. The Composserat, the Anti-Habsburg Wars, and the Beginning of the End, 1621 to 1800. George Thurzo's death created an immediate problem of ownership. His widow, Erzsébet Csobor, an illiterate woman who had, according to her own later account, learned to read and write only through her husband's personal instruction, managed the estate in the difficult years following the Palatine's death. But George had died without male heirs. His daughters were legally entitled to inherit, but the mechanisms of Hungarian inheritance law, as applied to major administrative estates, created complications that no straightforward lineage could resolve. The castle and its associated county could not simply pass to daughters in the way that ordinary noble property passed, because the administrative functions that came with it required formal royal appointment, and because multiple daughters with multiple interests created a divided ownership that the law had to structure carefully. The solution was the Orava composserat, a legal entity created to hold the castle and estate collectively on behalf of the Thurzo daughters and their descendants. The composserat was essentially a corporation, with elected administrators managing the property on behalf of the co-owners, distributing revenues according to shares determined by inheritance, and maintaining the estate's administrative functions. It was a legal innovation driven by specific circumstances, but it proved remarkably durable. The composserat would manage Orava Castle for nearly 2.5 centuries, surviving wars, political upheavals, and administrative crises that would have destroyed a simpler ownership arrangement. The 17th century brought the 30 Years' War's ripples to the Orava region, even as the fighting itself remained west of the Carpathians. The counter-Reformation pressure on Protestant nobles intensified throughout the Habsburg territories, and Orava's Lutheran identity, the chapel George had built, the churches he had funded, the Reformation institutions he had created on his estates, marked the castle as a center of Protestant resistance in a region where the Habsburgs were systematically dismantling Protestant institutions. The castle's involvement in the Boxkai uprising against Habsburg rule in 1606, before George's acquisition of formal ownership, had established a precedent for the castle's association with political resistance that subsequent generations would continue. The most direct military threat to the castle in the 17th century came from an unexpected direction: the Kuruk forces of the anti-Habsburg rebellions that erupted periodically through the second half of the century and culminated in the Great Uprising of Francis II Rákóczi in 1703. The Kuruk, Hungarian irregular forces fighting for constitutional rights and religious freedom against Habsburg absolutism, occupied substantial portions of the Hungarian highlands during Rákóczi's uprising, and Orava Castle was among the sites they seized. The occupation, which lasted until the suppression of the rebellion and the Treaty of Satmar in 1711, left the castle's fabric damaged and its administrative continuity disrupted. The pattern of fortifications being seized by those fighting against the power that had built them, a pattern as old as the castle itself, repeated itself in the 18th century. The gradual decline of the castle's strategic importance through the 18th century reflected broader changes in the political and military geography of Central Europe. The Ottoman threat that had justified the castle's massive defensive investment had receded. The Peace of Karlowitz in 1699 and the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718 removed the Ottomans from Hungary permanently. The anti-Habsburg rebellions that had used Orava had been suppressed. The trade route through the valley, while still commercially active, was no longer the critical military corridor it had been when the castle was built to watch it. The castle became what prosperous but strategically unnecessary properties always become: a residence for administrators, a venue for ceremonial functions, a symbol of inherited status rather than an active instrument of power. The administration under various composserat directors grew progressively less attentive to the fabric of the building itself. Maintenance deferred is deterioration guaranteed, and the wooden elements of the castle's structure, which had always required regular replacement in a mountain climate that combined heavy snowfall, freeze-thaw cycles, and occasional lightning, were not receiving the attention they needed. By the last decades of the 18th century, the castle was in a state of managed decline, functional but aging, inhabited by administrative staff rather than noble families, valued for its revenues rather than its architecture. The folklore of the 17th and 18th centuries at Orava settled into patterns characteristic of a castle in political turbulence and physical decline. The most widely distributed story concerns a treasure buried within the castle walls during one of the anti-Habsburg uprisings, usually specified as the Rákóczi period, by nobles who feared confiscation of their assets and who hid gold, silver, and valuables in spaces within the walls before fleeing. The nobles, in the versions of the story that have been collected, were killed before they could return to retrieve the treasure. Their descendants, who knew of its existence but not its precise location, periodically attempted to recover it and periodically gave up in frustration. The treasure remained in the walls. The treasure in the walls story is one of the most universal of castle folklore types, appearing in nearly every fortification that experienced periods of political instability. And Orava's version follows the template with characteristic local specificity without departing from it meaningfully. The end of the composserat castle as a living institution came on a night in 1800 when a fire started in the parsonage within the main courtyard. The cause was a chimney spark, the most common origin of fires in wooden heavy historic structures, banal in its domestic origin and catastrophic in its consequences. The fire burned for days. The wooden upper structures that gave the castle its distinctive silhouette, the galleries, the roofs, the internal floors and staircases, were consumed systematically as the blaze spread through a building that had accumulated flammable timber across centuries of construction. The bells in the chapel melted from the heat. The furnishings of the middle and upper castle were destroyed. Paintings, documents, furniture accumulated by the Thurzos and their successors over 2 centuries, gone in days of fire. What survived was the stone, the medieval keep, the Renaissance towers, the Corvinus Palace's vaulted stone chambers, the chapel walls. The castle's structural skeleton persisted even as everything that had made it habitable was destroyed. Francis Zicke, who administered the composserat at the time of the fire, secured the lower castle against further deterioration and preserved what could be preserved, but the middle and upper castle remained in ruins for 60 years. Stone shells standing above a river that had flowed past a castle on this spur for more than 5 centuries, now holding nothing but ash and emptied space. Chapter 6. The Ruin, the Museum, and the Vampire, 1800 to 1922. The castle that F.W. Murnau photographed in the summer of 1921 was the product of decades of partial restoration rather than the living castle it had been before the fire. The 60 years between the 1800 fire and the beginning of serious reconstruction were a period of ambiguous existence for Orava. The stone fabric deteriorated at a slower rate than wood would have, and the dramatic quality of ruined castles in the Romantic era, were not merely damaged buildings, but aesthetic objects, melancholy evidence of the passage of time and the fall of greatness, gave the castle a new kind of cultural value precisely in its damaged state. The Romantic movement's fascination with medieval ruins as emotional landscapes, as spaces where the past pressed physically against the present, made Orava attractive to painters and writers in ways it had never been when it was a functioning administrative center. An 1840 painting of the castle, showing the ruined towers above the river with romantic atmospheric lighting, circulated through the cultural networks of Central European Romanticism as a characteristic specimen of the picturesque. In 1868, Edmund Zicke, administrator of the composserat, organized the foundation that would establish one of Slovakia's first regional museums within the castle's surviving spaces. The first exhibition took place in the Thurzo Palace that year, opening the castle to public visitors as a cultural institution rather than simply as an administrative property. The significance of this decision is difficult to overstate in retrospect. It was the moment that Orava Castle began its transition from a historical property managed for its revenues to a heritage site managed for its cultural meaning. The distinction seems obvious in the modern era of heritage tourism, but in 1868 it represented a genuine choice about what the castle was for and what it was worth. The museum's establishment preceded the major restoration work that would give the castle its current form. Between 1894 and 1896, Paul Esterházy administered the property. His successor, Józef Pálffy, undertook the most substantial restoration campaign of the post-fire period, working between 1906 and 1912 to reconstruct and stabilize the central castle. Pálffy was working within significant financial constraints. The resources available to the composserat in this period were not adequate for the full restoration that the castle's 7th-century fabric demanded. But his intervention was enough to make substantial portions of the complex accessible, structurally sound, and visually impressive. The walls were reinforced with metal structural elements where the stone masonry had deteriorated. Roofs were rebuilt. Internal floors were restored to functionality. The castle that emerged from Pálffy's restoration was not the 16th-century Thurzo castle in any strict historical sense. It was a 19th and early 20th-century interpretation of what a medieval Slovak castle should look like, informed by the Romantic medievalism that pervaded European heritage restoration in this era and by the specific architectural evidence that the surviving stone fabric provided. The neo-Gothic elements that give the castle its distinctive silhouette today, the pointed profiles, the tower arrangements, the decorative stonework, reflect the aesthetic assumptions of the Romantic Restoration movement as much as they reflect any specific medieval original. Orava is, in this sense, a collaboration between centuries, the medieval core and the Romantic imagination that chose how to present it. The year 1918 brought political transformation that affected the castle as it affected every significant property in the region. The collapse of Austria-Hungary and the establishment of Czechoslovakia placed Orava within a new state, under a new legal framework, and in a new relationship to its own history. The composserat's co-ownership structure survived the political transition initially, but the post-First World War reorganization of property law in the new Czechoslovak state created pressures that the old Habsburg-era inheritance arrangements could not easily accommodate. It was into this context a partially restored castle that had been functioning as a museum for 50 years, in a region recently incorporated into a new democratic republic, accessible to European visitors in ways that the late Habsburg and early Czechoslovak rail network made possible. That F.W. Murnau's production team arrived in the summer of 1921 looking for a location that could represent the castle of a Transylvanian vampire. Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, was produced by Prana Film, a company founded in 1921 by the artist-producer Albin Grau and businessman Enrico Diekmann, with the explicit purpose of making films that engaged with occult themes. Grau was an initiate of occultist circles that included contact with the Ordo Templi Orientis and had personal convictions about the reality of supernatural phenomena that most of his contemporaries treated as literary fiction or superstition. For Grau, making a vampire film was not merely a commercial project, but an engagement with subject matter he took seriously, in ways that the film's subsequent reputation as artistic horror rather than sincere supernatural exploration has somewhat obscured. The screenplay by Henrik Galeen was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, with names and details changed to distance the production from copyright claims that Stoker's widow Florence would eventually pursue and win, securing a legal ruling that ordered every print of the film destroyed. The fact that any prints survived at all is attributable to the incomplete execution of that legal order, and cinematic history owes its knowledge of Murnau's masterwork to the same casual institutional failure that allows many other condemned objects to persist into posterity. The director chosen to realize Grau's vision was Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, 32 years old in 1921 and already a figure of considerable reputation in German cinema, despite the brevity of his directing career. Murnau had fought as a fighter pilot in the First World War, surviving 8 serious crashes. His close friend, Hans Ehrenbaum Degle, also believed to have been his lover, had been killed in action in 1915. The war had given Murnau an intimate familiarity with death and the borderlands of human experience that the subject matter of Nosferatu demanded. He brought to the project not the knowing cynicism of a filmmaker manipulating horror conventions for commercial purposes, but the conviction of a man who had looked at death closely and found it genuinely strange. Filming began in July 1921. The budget was tight enough to permit only a single camera. There would be one original negative, and if anything went wrong with it, there was no backup. The German scenes were shot primarily in the port cities of Wismar and Lübeck, whose medieval architecture provided the period ambience that the film required. But for the sequences set in Transylvania, the journey of the estate agent Hutter to the vampire's castle, the castle itself, the landscape of supernatural threat. Murnau needed something that Germany could not provide. No castle in Germany possessed the qualities Murnau was looking for: a combination of sheer verticality, apparent inaccessibility, and the specific quality of darkness made architectural. A building that looked not merely old or imposing, but genuinely inhuman in its relationship to the landscape around it. His production team was dispatched to find what Germany could not provide, and they found it in northern Slovakia. The crew arrived at Oravský podzámok, the village at the base of the castle cliff, whose name translates almost perfectly as Village Under the Castle, sometime in midsummer 1921. They photographed the castle from multiple angles, at different times of day, in conditions of light and shadow that Murnau used with the deliberateness of a painter. The exterior of the castle, rising from its cliff above the river, appeared in several key sequences of the completed film. The approach of Hutter to Count Orlok's domain, the establishing shots of the castle against the Carpathian landscape, and the distant views that placed the vampire's home in a geography that felt genuinely remote from the ordinary world. What made Orava so perfectly suited to Murnau's purposes was precisely what the 7 centuries of its history had made it: a structure that followed no single architectural logic, that accumulated asymmetries and additions and modifications across centuries without ever arriving at a comfortable wholeness, that jutted from its cliff in a way that seemed to deny the normal relationship between built and natural world. The castle did not sit on its rock. It grew from it, as if the stone had decided to become architectural rather than geological. For a director who wanted his vampire's home to feel not merely old, but genuinely other, to convey that Count Orlok inhabited a space that operated by different rules than the spaces his victims occupied, Orava was not merely adequate, it was ideal. The film crew also photographed the High Tatras, the Vratna Valley, and the Va River during their time in Slovakia. The landscape sequences in Nosferatu, the mountain vistas, the forest tracks, the river reflections, give the fictional Transylvania of the film a physical reality grounded in the actual landscape of northern Slovakia in the summer of 1921. Murnau was not interested in the obviously artificial. He deployed actual locations with the documentary instinct of a director who understood that genuine place generates genuine atmosphere in ways that constructed sets cannot replicate. Nosferatu premiered at the Marble Hall of the Berlin Zoological Garden on March 4, 1922, at an elaborate society evening called the Festival of Nosferatu, with guests invited to arrive in Biedermeier costume. Critical response was largely positive. Hans Wollenberg described it as a sensation and praised Murnau's nature sequences as mood-creating elements. The film's innovative use of natural light, practical locations, and camera tricks, fast motion to make the vampire move unnaturally, negative film for supernatural effects, the famous moment of Orlok rising rigid from his coffin, established visual conventions for vampire cinema that have persisted for a century. Florence Stoker's lawsuit, filed on behalf of her late husband's estate, proceeded through the German courts and resulted in the 1925 ruling that ordered all copies of the film destroyed. The Prana Film Company was bankrupted by the judgment. A small number of prints survived in various archives and collections, their existence unknown or unreported to the authorities executing the court order. By the time the legal situation was resolved, Murnau had left Germany for Hollywood, where he would make Sunrise, 1927, often considered the greatest silent film ever made. Before his death in a car accident in 1931 at the age of 42. The castle in Slovakia, which had been the setting for a German film made by a gay director about an occultist's vision of supernatural predation, went on with its own history in the new state of Czechoslovakia, largely unaware of the cinematic reputation it had acquired. The visitors who came to the Orava Museum in the 1920s and 1930s came for Slovak history, not vampire mythology. The connection between the limestone cliff above the river and Count Orlok's castle was known in Germany and in the film world, but had not yet penetrated the specific culture of the Orava Valley or the new Czechoslovak state. Chapter 7. The Second World War, Communism and the National Monument, 1939 to present. The Second World War reached Orava as it reached every part of Central Europe, though the castle's specific wartime role was modest compared to its longer historical importance. Slovakia, which had declared independence in March 1939 under German pressure and existed as the Slovak state, a nominally independent but effectively German-controlled entity through the war years, provided the political framework within which the castle operated after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. The German military used the castle during the war period as an observation post, exploiting its commanding position above the valley for the same strategic purposes that had made the site valuable since the 13th century. The museum collections were maintained through the war period as best the available staff could manage. The most significant wartime event in the castle's vicinity was the Slovak National Uprising of August 1944, the armed resistance movement of the Slovak population against the German occupation and the collaborationist Slovak state. The uprising centered in the Banska Bystrica region, not far south of Orava, and the German military response to it transformed the security situation across the entire Slovak territory. The Orava region was not the center of the fighting, but the proximity of major military operations to a castle that housed irreplaceable cultural collections created genuine concerns about the collection's safety. The military administration ultimately abandoned the castle to prevent its destruction, a decision that reflects the specific calculation of a garrison facing military pressure, choosing not to make a building a target by defending it. The establishment of the Czechoslovak Republic in 1945 and the subsequent communist consolidation of power in the Czechoslovakia coup of February 1948 transformed the castle's ownership structure in the way that communist nationalization transformed all significant property in Czechoslovakia. The Orava composserat, the legal entity that had held the castle since the early 17th century, surviving revolutions, wars, and the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, was dissolved. The castle became state property, nationalized along with the museums, collections, and estates that the composserat had managed. In 1953, Orava Castle was declared a National Cultural Monument of Czechoslovakia and placed under the management of the Orava Museum. The formal declaration of national monument status was accompanied by a comprehensive restoration program that ran from 1953 to 1968, involving structural stabilization, architectural restoration, and the development of museum exhibitions that would make the castle accessible to public visitors in a systematic, rather than ad hoc way. The communist government's investment in heritage sites of this kind was consistent with the broader ideology of the period. National monuments were expressions of the deep historical identity of the Slovak people, whose heritage the communist state presented itself as preserving and promoting even as it dismantled the class structures and property arrangements through which that heritage had been created and maintained. The 1953 to 1968 restoration work gave the castle much of the physical character that contemporary visitors encounter. The residential chambers of the Thurzo era were reconstructed and furnished to period style, giving visitors an impression of life at the height of the castle's Renaissance magnificence. The Knight's Room was developed as a showcase for the military history of the castle and the region. The painting gallery displayed portraits and artworks recovered from or associated with the castle's noble inhabitants. The weapon room assembled the military material culture of successive centuries. And the chapel, the centerpiece of George Thurzo's building program, with its Renaissance grave monument and Baroque altar, was restored to a condition that conveyed the religious sophistication of the Palatine's court. The communist-era interpretation of the castle's history followed the ideological patterns characteristic of the period's heritage management across the Eastern Bloc. The feudal and noble periods were presented through a class struggle framework that emphasized the exploitation of the Slovak peasantry by Hungarian and other noble lords, and the castle's administrative function, its role as the seat of the county, the center of tax collection, the place where justice was administered on behalf of the powerful against the less powerful, was foregrounded in ways that aligned with the Marxist narrative of historical oppression. The Thurzo era received particular attention as a period of peak feudal power, with George Thurzo's role in the Bathory case presented as evidence of how the noble class protected its own at the expense of justice. What the communist interpretation downplayed, predictably, was the Nosferatu connection. A castle famous for its role in a German horror film made by a bourgeois expressionist director for an occultist producer was not an obvious fit for the heritage narrative that the Slovak communist state was constructing. The film was known to specialists and to those with access to Western cultural media, but it was not foregrounded in the museum's public presentation. The castle's fame as a medieval fortress, as the seat of the Palatine of Hungary, as a monument to Slovak historical continuity under foreign rulers, these were the stories the communist-era museum told. The vampire connection was available to those who sought it, but was not offered to those who did not. The Velvet Revolution of 1989 and the subsequent dissolution of Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Divorce that created the Czech Republic and Slovakia as independent states on January 1, 1993, transformed the political context within which Orava Castle was managed without immediately transforming the museum itself. The Orava Museum continued as the managing institution. The castle continued as a national cultural monument. The guided tours continued along the established routes. What changed was the interpretive atmosphere. The ideological constraints that had shaped the communist-era narrative were removed, and the castle's history could be presented in its full complexity without the requirement to fit it into a Marxist framework. The Nosferatu connection moved from margin to center in the post-communist interpretation of the castle. In the contemporary museum, the 1922 film is explicitly acknowledged and celebrated. A dedicated section of the exhibitions addresses the filmmaking history, with materials related to the Nosferatu production and subsequent films shot at the castle. The castle's fame as a filming location has become a significant draw for international visitors who come knowing the film rather than the history, and the museum has adapted to serve this audience while ensuring that the actual history, 7 centuries of Slovak and Hungarian medieval history, is presented alongside the cinematic legend. The 2020 BBC and Netflix television adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, created by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, returned to Orava Castle a second time, using it once more as Castle Dracula in a production that consciously cited the 1922 original in its choice of location. The self-referential quality of this choice, returning to the castle that Murnau had used for the unauthorized Dracula adaptation to make an authorized Dracula adaptation, closed a century-long loop between the castle's stone walls and the vampire mythology that Murnau had attached to them. Orava had been cast as a vampire's home twice by different directors, a century apart each time because the combination of verticality, darkness, and geological improbability that Murnau had recognized in 1921 remained as visually compelling as it had ever been. The castle today receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, drawn by a combination of genuine historical interest and the cinematic association that has made it internationally recognizable. The 754 stairs that connect the castle's levels, 754 steps climbed since the 13th century by guards, merchants, nobles, administrators, prisoners, diplomats, film crews, and tourists, remain the primary physical experience of a visit. The ascent organizes the castle's history spatially. The Baroque church and Thurzo palace at the bottom, the Renaissance and Gothic courts in the middle, the medieval keep at the top, each layer encoding the century that built it. A visitor who climbs all 754 stairs passes through 700 years in approximately 20 minutes. In November 2025, a €4.5 million restoration project introduced augmented reality features to the visitor experience, allowing digital reconstruction of periods and spaces that physical restoration cannot recover. The augmented reality presentations show the Thurzo court at its 16th century peak, the castle in its pre-fire condition, the Corvinus Palace as it appeared when newly completed. The technological layer added over the physical layer recalls the multiple layers of the castle's own history. Every generation added to what it found, producing the palimpsest that visitors navigate today. The folklore persists in the museum's contemporary presentation, alongside the history, appropriately framed but not dismissed. The story of the prisoner who dug the well and was not released is told on tours as a legend rather than a fact, which it probably is, while acknowledging that the difficulty of the well's actual construction was genuinely extreme. The story of the devil who built the castle, one of the oldest local legends, claiming that no human effort could have placed those walls on that cliff without supernatural assistance, is told as evidence of the castle's psychological impact on the people who observed it through centuries of use, which is also true. The Bathory connection is presented with the scholarly ambivalence it deserves. The crimes were probably real. The investigation was certainly shaped by political interests, and the relationship between George Thurzo's legitimate horror at what he found and his calculating assessment of his own interests in the outcome cannot be cleanly separated. The limestone spur rises from the Orava River exactly as it rose from the river when the first human beings recognized its strategic value. The water moves below it as it always has, curving around the rock that the river's own erosion shaped over millennia. The castle on the rock has burned and been rebuilt, been seized and recovered, been administered and abandoned and restored. It has been a royal watching post, a county seat, a Renaissance palace, a center of Reformation theology, the administrative base of the man who imprisoned the Blood Countess, a ruin, a museum, a vampire's lair in one of the most influential films in cinema history, a communist heritage monument, and a contemporary tourist destination. All of these at once, because a place that has been inhabited since the Bronze Age accumulates identities the way the rock itself accumulates geological strata. Layer over layer, each one real, none of them erasable, all of them present simultaneously in the structure that visitors climb today. The 754 stairs, the 154 rooms, the river 112 meters below, the cliff that Murnau's camera found and made immortal, and that the history made strange long before any camera arrived to notice.